Paul is a very prominent character in the New Testament of the Bible, isn't he? And there's a lot written about Paul in the New Testament, and in fact Paul himself was responsible for writing quite a lot of what we find in the New Testament. And when we look at the Bible, we can see that a large proportion of the book of the Acts, a little bit of which we've just read for our introductory reading, a large portion of that book of Acts is devoted to the history of the work that Paul did in preaching the message of Christianity throughout the Roman world of the time. And if we look at the New Testament, we find that a large part of it is made up of Paul's writings, in particular the letters that he wrote to some of the churches that he helped to establish, and also to individual believers who were in those churches. So it's obvious, isn't it, from just those few facts, that Paul is an important person in the life of the early Christian church. But Paul started his life, and he started his religious career in a very different way indeed. Because we find that, in fact, the early part of Paul's life was spent as an upcoming force, a force to be reckoned with in the Jewish faith. He was a man who was destined to become an important member of the Jewish community. He was destined for great things until that day, that one day in his life that changed everything, when he was travelling from Jerusalem to Damascus. And we've just read about that, haven't we? And we'll come back to that shortly. One thing that we need to note about Paul is that during his early life, before he became a Christian, he was known by his Jewish name of Saul. And so as we look at the book of the Acts, we find that in the early part of it he's referred to as Saul, and it's only later on that he became known as Paul, which is the Roman form of his Jewish name, Saul. So what do we know then about this man, Saul of Tarsus, who became eventually Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ? Well, there are a number of places during Paul's later life where he speaks about who he was and where he came from, and we can build up a picture of the man from what he tells us. So we're going to have a look at some of these, and we can see what we can find out about Paul. So come on, machine, work. There we go. In Acts 22 and verse 3, we can read these words where he says, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. He talks about being brought up in this city because he's speaking in Jerusalem. He's telling people about his background, and he says, as we already know, that he was a Jew, that he was born in Tarsus in Cilicia. You can see that highlighted on the map there. It's now in southeast Turkey. Obviously it wasn't Turkey then, but that's where we see it today. He was brought up in Jerusalem and studied under this man called Gamaliel, who was one of the very greatest and most respected rabbis in first century Jewish community. And thus, because he studied under this notable person, he probably had one of the very best educations in his society that it was possible for his time. And because of his upbringing and his background, he became fully devoted to his faith in God, his faith as a Jew. And so we're starting to build up a picture, aren't we, of who this man was. If we look at one of his letters, the letter to the Philippians, and chapter 3 and verse 5, we find that he adds these little snippets of information. He says that he was circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, an Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee. So those are the extra bits that he's telling us, that he was of the Jewish tribe of Benjamin. That was the sort of family line that he was born into, and that he was also a Pharisee. And in Acts chapter 23 and verse 6, he adds this, where he says, I'll just pick it up in the middle of the verse. He says, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. So he's telling them there, isn't he, that he was not just a Pharisee in his background, but he was also born into a line of the family of Pharisees. So we can see then, can't we, in our summary slide, we can add those details as well, that he was from the tribe of Benjamin in the Jewish community, he was a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. Let's think for a moment about what a Pharisee was, because I think that helps us to understand something more of what Saul of Tarsus was. And this is a description of what the Pharisees were, taken from Wikipedia. It tells us that the Pharisees were at various times a political party, a social movement, and a school of thought in the Holy Land during the time of the Second Temple Judaism. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Pharisaic beliefs became the foundational, liturgical and ritualistic basis for rabbinic Judaism. There's a lot of jargon in there, isn't there? But I think we can see from that they were really less of a religious organisation than a political one. And so I think we can build up a sort of summary of what the Pharisees were, at least thinking it particularly from the religious point of view, because despite their political leanings, they also were very strong in their religious beliefs. They were strong believers in the Torah, and that's the first 5 books of the Old Testament as we have them, the 5 books of Moses, which was the written law that the Jews believed. And they were very strong believers in what the Torah says. But they also developed an oral law, which was a commentary on those first 5 books of Moses called the Torah, and they used this oral law to explain the laws that were given in the Torah and to explain how to carry out the commandments that were written in the Torah. And to some degree, the oral law actually became more important to them than the written law of Moses. They also believed in an afterlife, and they believed in the resurrection of the dead. So this is the way of thinking that Saul of Tarsus was brought up into. His father being a Pharisee, he would have been steeped in this way of thinking from a very early age. And in Acts chapter 22 and verses 3 to 5, he gives a description of how he responded to this upbringing in his attitude to the early Christian church. He says, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia. We've seen that, haven't we? And he says, he was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. And I persecuted this way, he's talking about the Christian belief, the Christian system, Christian church, I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus, to bring them which were there, bound unto Jerusalem, for to be punished. So he's telling us about himself here, isn't he? And saying that he saw himself as being zealous toward God. And because of his zeal towards what he believed God wanted, he persecuted the Christian church and the Christian believers, even having them put to death. And he was also acting on the authority of the Jewish leaders. They were endorsing what he was doing and giving him special authority to do these things, to persecute the Christians. So Saul of Tarsus saw the Christians as a false religion. He saw them as people having beliefs which are in opposition to the teaching of Judaism, and he saw it as something that must be stamped out at all costs. And as I said, he had the support of the Jewish establishment behind him in this aim to stamp out this, what he saw as a false religion. Now, to complete our picture of Saul of Tarsus, there's just one extra detail which is given to us later on in Acts chapter 22, and in verses 25 to 28 we read these words. Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman, uncondemned? Then we skip on to verse 27, where the chief captain came and said unto him, Tell me, art thou a Roman? And he, Paul, said, Yes. And the chief captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, But I was free-born. So what this tells us is that in addition to his exalted status in the Jewish community, Paul also enjoyed a privileged status within Roman society as well. And it's something that he seems to have inherited from his parents, since he describes himself as being free-born. So not only was he born into one of the highest levels of Jewish society, he was also born into one of the higher levels of Roman society as well. So he was a very privileged person. These are some of the privileges that were enjoyed by someone with the status of Roman citizenship. Roman citizenship. He would have been blessed with safety from the death penalty. He would have been given the right to vote. He had the right to make contracts, the right to contract a legal marriage, and also a child became a citizen if both its parents were already citizens, which is presumably why Paul was a Roman citizen born into that position. And there were certain other privileges that they had to be given fair treatment. So Saul of Tarsus then was a powerful man, wasn't he? A powerful man in the society of his day, not only in his native Jewish community, but also in the wider community of the Roman Empire. He was a man destined for greatness in many possible ways. And because of that zeal that he had for the Jewish religion, he threw himself, as we've seen, into fiercely trying to stamp out what he saw as a false new religion, trying to destroy those who followed this Jesus from Nazareth. But it would have been impossible for him to have been ignorant of Jesus, wouldn't it? And it would have been impossible for him to have been ignorant of Jesus' teachings and the miracles that he did. He would certainly have known all about the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus, and he would have heard what he thought of as tales of the resurrection of Jesus. He might well have heard about the day of Pentecost, which is recorded for us in the 2nd chapter of the book of the Acts, when the speech from the Apostle Peter resulted in thousands of converts to Christianity. Saul of Tarsus would no doubt have witnessed the continual growth of the Christian church, despite all his efforts and the efforts of others to try and crush it. It had expanded from 120 members at the beginning of the book of the Acts to add another 3,000 in that incident in chapter 2 when Peter spoke to the people, and another 5,000 added to them in Acts chapter 4, and the church just continued growing almost exponentially. And Acts chapter 6 tells us that even many of the Jewish priests were becoming converts to Christianity. So Saul would have known all about this. And he would have known about the miraculous release from prison of the apostles who had been put in prison by the Jewish authorities. That's recorded in Acts chapter 5. And he would have known about the warning from Gamaliel, the man he'd studied under, who warned the people to be careful about what they did with these apostles of Jesus Christ. And it's certain, because the record tells us, that Saul was there to hear the speech in chapter 7 of the Acts that Stephen made, defending the Christian beliefs and showing how they were brought out of the true Jewish beliefs. And he would have known of the fact that nobody could oppose the words that Stephen spoke, and their only answer to stop Stephen having influence on the people was to kill him. And Saul himself was there approving of his execution. So it was all these pressures, all these background pressures that Saul was no doubt experiencing that led Saul of Tarsus to that road to Damascus, going there full of hate for this false religion that seemed impossible to stamp out, but also full of doubts because of what he'd seen and what he'd heard. And thus we come to our introductory chapter, Acts chapter 9, and we read, didn't we, that Saul fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. So as we read, this was the turning point in the life of Saul of Tarsus. It was here that his life changed direction completely, from being a persecutor of Christians into being an important and prominent preacher of Christianity. And he went on to establish many Christian churches all around the Roman world, making probably many thousands of converts. So all the doubts that Saul had been having up to this point were now brought into sharp focus as he was confronted with the very man, with Jesus Christ, who he'd been so convinced up to this point was just a hoax, was just an imposter. Now Saul knew who he really was, and that this man truly was alive from the dead. Now we don't have time in a short talk such as this to go into all the details of the events in the life of Saul from here onwards, but I think we can summarise what happened with him and get a picture of how he developed as a Christian believer and eventually started his preaching campaigns all around the Roman world. It looks from the record in the book of the Acts and from some of the things that he writes about in his later letters that what happened to him was this. After his conversion and in the face of persecution in Damascus, he fled into Arabia to think over his new beliefs and his change of circumstances. And it's possibly as much as 3 years later that he returned to Damascus, but in the face of further persecution he had to flee again to Jerusalem this time. But because of yet more trouble that he experienced there, he was sent back to his hometown of Tarsus. And it's sometime later that we're told in Acts chapter 11 that Barnabas, a prominent member of the church in Antioch, went to Tarsus to bring Saul back with him to become a member of the Antioch church, because there'd been a church established in Antioch for a little while by that time. And it was while they were at Antioch that Barnabas and Saul were called to begin their work of spreading the gospel message to a wider audience around the Roman world. It says in Acts chapter 13, as they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Spirit said, Separate me Barnabas and Saul for the work whereunto I have called them. And so this call, this commission, if you like, to go out and spread the message of the Christian gospel message led Saul to make 3 extensive journeys around Asia and into Greece. The first journey, highlighted there in green, took him from Antioch, the church in Antioch, via Cyprus and into the central part of Asia, establishing several churches along the way. His second journey, highlighted in red, took him back through Central Asia, but onwards into the west and into Greece. And then the third journey covered similar ground, highlighted this time in green, covering similar ground to the second journey and returning eventually back to Jerusalem. And it was because Saul generally concentrated on bringing Gentiles to the faith rather than the Jews. I mean, that was part of what he'd been commissioned to do by Jesus on that road to Damascus. But it was the Jews who so often violently opposed everything that Paul tried to do and tried to say. And thus he became known generally by his other name of Paul, the Roman form of his name, rather than the Jewish form of Saul. And so that's why, generally speaking, we found him spoken of as Paul in the New Testament record. It was while he was at Jerusalem, at the end of his third missionary journey. You can see that the journey ended back in the land of Israel. And in Acts chapter 21, it tells us that Paul was apprehended by the Jews and accused by them of certain false accusations, and he was arrested and imprisoned by the Roman authorities. And after being heard a number of times before various rulers, he was eventually moved to appeal to be heard by Caesar. And that resulted in him being sent to Rome. And it was on this journey over the Mediterranean Sea that the Acts record, at the end of the book, gives us the dramatic account of his shipwreck on the island of Malta on his way to Rome. And the book of the Acts ends by telling us about Paul's eventual arrival in Rome and how he was kept under house arrest as he waited for his hearing before Caesar. What happened to Paul after that is rather less clear, because the Bible record of his life ends at that point. There are some snippets of information that we can glean from the letters of Paul, and it seems that what probably happened was that he was tried in Rome before Caesar and acquitted and set free. And he took the opportunity to do more travelling and preaching, and it's possible that he even went as far afield as into Spain. But at some point it seems that he was rearrested and found himself again in prison in Rome, and this time he was tried and he was condemned to death. And it's possible that he was sent to the lions in a Roman arena. None of that is absolutely certain, but that's possibly what happened to him. And we're told very little about his later life in the Bible record. So that then is a brief look at the life of this man who started his life as a persecutor of the Christian church, but spent most of his life as a preacher of that he had originally tried to stamp out. And he ended his life by dying for the beliefs that he had. But more important than all these details of the life history of the Apostle Paul is to ask ourselves, what did he believe? What did he preach? What was it that made him give his life over after his conversion to spreading the beliefs that he held? Well, if we go back to his background, we remember how he started his life as a man who had his beliefs firmly founded in Old Testament Judaism. And he believed in the promises that were made by God in the Old Testament to his ancestors. Promises about the Jewish nation being God's special people, a people who would eventually come to rule the world. He believed that the kingdom of God was eventually going to be established in Israel, and it would have its influence worldwide. And he would believe that someone would come, a Messiah would come, who would become king in that kingdom of God and rule the whole world. It was only after his conversion that Paul could see that it was Jesus of Nazareth who was indeed that Messiah. And it was Jesus of Nazareth who was destined to be that king of the kingdom of God. And also that he was the only one through whom mankind could have any hope of a future life. That all the promises and the hopes that were presented in the Old Testament were in fact fulfilled in Jesus. So Paul would have read, for example, the Old Testament passage of Genesis chapter 12, and he would have seen in them promises made to Abraham, the Jewish forefather. The Lord said unto Abraham, I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. We can see, can't we, how he would have understood these promises that were made to his forefathers, and he would have seen the fulfillment of them through Jesus once he'd realized who Jesus was. As he would have seen in Genesis chapter 22 then, he would have seen promises of one particular descendant through whom these blessings would be accomplished. Verse 17 says that in blessing I will bless thee. This is God speaking to Abraham. And in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So this is God's promise to Abraham of one particular descendant through whom these blessings would be accomplished. And again, Paul would have come to realize that this was going to be fulfilled through Jesus of Nazareth. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, Paul would have seen promises made by God to King David. It says there, I will set up thy seed, David's descendant, after thee, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And thine house and thine kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. So we would have seen from this passage that promise of one particular descendant of David who would become king of Israel. He would have seen that one particular descendant would have established a kingdom that would last forever. And that this descendant would in fact not only be a direct descendant of David himself, but also be the Son of God himself. And Paul would know that the Old Testament contained a very large number of prophecies about this Messiah who was to come. Apparently there are about, I haven't counted them myself, but apparently there are about 60 different prophecies in the Old Testament about a coming Messiah, with more than 300 individual references to this promise. So Paul would understand, wouldn't he, that the Old Testament spoke about this in a number of different ways, telling of a prophet who was to come, one who would be like Moses in many ways, that this person would be a descendant of David, who would be like David in character in many ways, David being described as a man after God's own heart, a man who tried to think like God did. He would have known that the Old Testament prophecies spoke of a descendant of Abraham, who would share Abraham's faith and Abraham's determination to obey God. But he would have also read passages that he found much more difficult to understand with his Jewish background until he was confronted with the truth of Jesus. He would have perhaps read Psalm 22 that speaks of a man suffering terribly to bring about the purpose of God. And it's a psalm that we now can see with the benefit of hindsight, and that Paul no doubt would have been able to see once he'd encountered Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. That this psalm was speaking in amazing detail about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and foretelling what was going to happen and telling why as well. You would have read Isaiah chapter 53 that speaks of the Messiah being sacrificed to fulfill the purpose of God. The idea of Messiah being sacrificed was something that went so much against what the Jews wanted to believe. And Psalm 16, which speaks of the resurrection of Messiah. Paul, of course, in his early days, like most Jews, if not all the Jews, had been expecting the Messiah to come because the scriptures said that he would come. But few of them, if any of them at all, realized that the Messiah had a role as a sacrifice, that Messiah had to die and had to be raised again to life. Despite the fact that the Old Testament scriptures spoke about this, they only saw the role of the Messiah as a king and expected that king to take over the world. And certainly in the context of the Roman Empire, they would have seen him as someone who would rescue them from Roman domination. But of course, because Jesus of Nazareth had been arrested, Jesus had been crucified, and thus, as far as they were concerned, he was dead, then Paul, along with many of the other Jews, would have come to the conclusion that he must have been an impostor. He couldn't have been the Messiah at all. And so this religion based on belief in the risen Christ must have been false and had to be stopped. But we've seen, haven't we, on the Damascus Road, how Paul met the risen Messiah. He met Jesus Christ. And from then on, he was convinced of the truth about him. And he preached Jesus as the only one through whom we can be saved. He preached in words like these in Acts chapter 17, where he said, God hath appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. In Acts chapter 26, he says, I continue unto this day witnessing both to small and great, saying none other things than those which the prophets and Moses did say should come, that Christ should suffer, and that he should be the first that should rise from the dead, and should show light unto the people and to the Gentiles. And that's a remarkable passage, isn't it? The way that he emphasizes that the things that were written in the Old Testament, which were misunderstood by so many, actually spoke clearly about the Messiah, the Christ, who would go through all these things in the purpose of God. So it was the fact of the risen Christ that changed Paul from persecutor to preacher. For him, it was the most important event in the whole of human history, because it changed everything. Instead of being lost with no hope, mankind now had a hope to look forward to, because Jesus had made it possible for us to be reconciled to God and to be able to look forward to a future where sin and death were no more the curse of mankind. The promise of a future where the beauty and the loveliness of a world ruled by God through Jesus Christ, his Son, would result in all the promises and all the hopes that were made in the Old Testament scriptures becoming reality in the kingdom of God. So, Saul of Tarsus, a Jew who was full of zeal for the things of God, a man who fully believed that Jesus was an impostor and the Christian church was an abomination and should be stamped out, was brought abruptly to a stop on that road to Damascus. It was there that he realized who Jesus was and what Jesus represented. And he saw from then on that all the promises in the Old Testament Bible were fulfilled in Jesus, and that the only hope for any kind of meaningful future for people hinged on belief in Jesus. And it's through Paul's writings, along with all the other things that we can read in the Bible, that we too can learn about this wonderful hope for the future that Paul the Apostle spent the rest of his life preaching with such zeal and enthusiasm.